Okay, well, here's our week three update for college. This was a busy week. We had a lot of information to cover and talk about. For this week, a couple things that really stood out in the Christianity class was just a lot of stuff. So we were covering from like the 400s up to about 1200 AD. So getting up into the Crusades. Crusades were around 1000 to 1200 AD time frame. So we're just getting up into the Crusades era there. Um, the idea of martyrdom, I know I talked last week a little bit about martyrdom, some of the things that were different there. This week we learned a little bit more about martyrdom, and what was fascinating this week about martyrdom is, if you think about it, martyrdom back in the first, second, third century time frame, even up into fourth centuries, uh, from the time of Christ, basically, up to the time of Constantine, martyrdom was something that was kind of seen as a good thing. I mean, if you died for your beliefs, that was kind of like you get extra points to get into heaven kind of idea. You were seen as an amazing Christian if you died for your beliefs. And as that got more and more as time went on, of course, as more time went on, more people were venerated as martyrs. It was cool to be martyred. If you're going to die, be martyred because it gets you into heaven better. But what's fascinating is after Constantine basically made Christianity the state religion, he, in the fourth century, martyrdom changed because persecution wasn't as big of an issue for Christians. So they had to rethink, what does it mean to be a martyr? They, in their efforts to still kind of glorify martyrdom and go in this path, they started to come around to an idea of martyrs being somebody who goes out and basically persecutes another religion. So you'd go out to another town, another part of the countryside, head to another country that's not Christian, find a non-Christian religion like a building, something like a place of worship for paganism, like a temple for idols or something like that, and then you'd destroy it. You would persecute them, and then they would get mad and kill you, and you died as a martyr. So you kind of had to make martyrdom up. You kind of had to create the situation that caused your own death. And that was seen as martyrdom for a little while. It was kind of a weird idea. Martyrdom later changed, thankfully, away from this idea, but I think it was still kind of it kind of feels like it was a little bit of a remnant of, that was still around that encouraged the philosophy of the Crusades. However, martyrdom kind of changed to not so much being persecuted and killed for your beliefs, but somebody who stood up for their beliefs, somebody who is going to be more of a missionary and suffer at the hands of other people while on a mission, not necessarily die, but be beat up or something. So the idea of martyrdom became connected to missionary work later on. So that's kind of an interesting point. I didn't realize that, how. So we talked about some of the doctrines that are we hear about today in some of the Orthodox religions, like transubstantiation. So transubstantiation is the concept of, how do we think of the sacrament? Okay, in the New Testament, Jesus, when he is administering the sacrament during the Last Supper, mentions to his apostles, "This is my blood and my flesh that you're eating basically for this." And some churches, more in the Orthodox area, so that's your Eastern Orthodox, your Catholic, those kinds of groups, they have a tendency to see this in a more literal sense. So transubstantiation is the doctrine of understanding that the Eucharist and the wine, like right after you take it into your mouth, it turns into the blood and flesh of Christ. So like as you're swallowing it, it stays as a Eucharist, but it turns, so it's, the effect of it is as if you're not just drinking a little piece of, little wine and a little piece of cracker. You're digesting the blood and flesh of Christ himself. So that's the doctrine of transubstantiation. It didn't come around to about 831 AD. It's not original. It's not something. Now, a lot of people would point to the New Testament to say, oh yeah, it is original, but it wasn't talked about till 831. I don't even think it became a full doctrine until 1261, something like that. I could be wrong. Maybe it was 831. It was made a full doctrine, but it wasn't before then. So that was interesting. I didn't realize how late in the early Christianity that transubstantiation came around. We did talk a little bit about saints and how you become a saint and why they picked saints. It's interesting because it all goes back to their perception of Christ. Remember last week we talked about how defining who Christ really was he human, was he divine, was he both, was a big issue for the first couple hundred years. Then, who was God and Christ's relationship with God and how did that work? That's the Trinity, the Nicene Creed, in the 4th century. Later on, they said that their idea, the concept of Christ, became less and less personal, more and more away from them. Like, Christ is so amazing, he doesn't talk to us anymore. He doesn't mess with us. He doesn't do anything with us humans anymore. He's just up in heaven doing his thing, and he's the ultimate judge, and so we can't talk with him. He's untouchable to an extent. And so we can revere him, but we don't talk to him. And so the problem is now who answers our prayers? If we can't reach Christ, how do we talk with Christ and work with him? That's where the idea came of saints. Who is somebody else we can pray to that might have some pull to talk to Christ? Now, the number one ultimate person to talk to would be his mother, Mary. So that's where veneration of Mary came a big deal. So if Christ is untouchable, we can't get to Christ, we pray to Mary and she delivers the message to Christ. That's kind of how it worked. It's interesting because in my Chinese class, we talked about the idea of veneration of your elders, your descendants. So they believe in a God, like a supreme being. Basically, there's a heaven, there's a supreme being that ancient Chinese culture believes in. And what they believed was to talk to the supreme being, you talk to your ancestors who then go talk to the supreme being and gain favors, and that helps promote them in heaven as well. And then they come back and help you through what the answer is that the supreme being gives them. So there's kind of a similar idea, not quite the same reasoning, but a similar idea in ancient China as well. So those are some interesting ideas that came up this week in my Christianity class. Some pretty fun things to learn there about Christianity as it spread. One thing we learned about, I thought this was really cool. So one thing we got into was Christianity in Ireland. Christianity reached Ireland kind of late because it's kind of out there where Ireland is, but it eventually did make it to Ireland. So here's the problem though, is in the 800 to 1200 period, as well as the Crusades idea was going on, the concept of monasticism really took off and did more. So monasteries, monks, nuns, living a celibate life, living a more ascetic life became a bigger deal. Asceticism is quite common in Asia, in Africa, those places. That was kind of common. You go out into the desert and you live off the land, you live a hard life, but you spend a lot of time fasting and praying, and that helps you to overcome the flesh, the mortality, and allow your spirit to do more. Asceticism was huge in India, in a lot of like Hinduism and Jainism and stuff. It did a lot over there. In Christianity, the idea of monasticism, going off, leaving the rest of the world behind, living a life, lots of fasting and prayer, those kinds of things, hard work, poor conditions, to where you're always kind of suffering. It just you kind of have to embrace the suck, if you will. I think early Christianity adopted that before the Marines did. Um, but anyways, in Ireland, they're on an island. It's not like it's a huge island, so there's no like desert to go off to do this kind of a life. So what they did is they actually went off to a small island off the coast of Ireland called Skellig Michael, and you can look it up. It's really cool. And that's where they live. Now, there's not like trees and things out there. I mean, it's a tiny little island. So they built huts basically out of flat rock. And they built, what was it called now? A Corbin curve? Oh man, what was it called now? Not Corbin circle, like a Corbin dome, I think is what it was. And what it is you just lay the rocks, and you keep laying more rocks on top, but you slowly bring those rocks closer, and eventually it creates a dome. They That's what they built. So they're basically it's a self-sustaining structure. They don't need a beam or a support inside to hold it up. The walls hold itself up. If you are a Star Wars fan, you will remember this place. So they were out there, I think around the 800s AD, building Skellig Michael out to be this monastery. But it was used in Star Wars. This is the tiny island that Luke Skywalker banishes himself to, claiming it's an ancient Jedi temple or monastery. And so that's that island that he goes to. Ray goes out and finds him. That's Skellig Michael. It actually was a monastery in around the 800 time frame, if I remember right. So it was kind of cool. That actually is a monastery, a living monks living a very hard celibate life. Lots of again praying and fasting and things because there's just not much out there. You can only get to that island couple months out of a whole year, but because the weather gets crazy on it. So yeah, that's where they did. It's kind of cool that they kind of weaved in an actual real monastery into the Star Wars canon through where Luke Skywalker was hiding out. So that was kind of cool. We learned about that island a little bit this week as well. It was kind of fun. So a lot of cool stuff in the Chinese history one. We're talking about some of the early dynasties of China. The Zhou Dynasty, it's Zhou, is how it's spelled, but it's pronounced Zhou. It was really cool, really interesting to see how some of these early dynasties formed. Out of the Zhou Dynasty was where we get Confucianism, we get Taoism, and legalism, which is an interesting terminology. I think we're going to study more about those next week, so I'll have more of an update on those next week. The Zhou Dynasty went from being a full, like big dynasties unified to falling apart, turning into a whole bunch of small little kingdoms that started warring amongst themselves, and it turned into a big mess before they kind of later came back together, I think, in the later dynasty. But it's going to be interesting to see. I'm loving that class. It's a really fun class to take. In my Intro to Religion class, Intro to Religious Studies class, we've just been talking about the classification of religion. So it's interesting. I never thought about this, but as science evolved, so science has technically been around for a very long time. We hear of Galileo, Copernicus, Sir Isaac Newton, and others in history that did scientific things. The problem is they didn't have like a classification like we have of science today. So most of the science we understand today has only been around since the early 1800s, sometime in the 1700s to now. So just a couple hundred years, we've been spending really digging in and researching history, archaeology, other things like that. So it's not like it's been there all the time. It hasn't. So as science has progressed, they look at religion and realize, how do we define what is a world religion and what's not? How do we look at religion? And so they've used Christianity as the model, basically, the standard. Okay, Christianity is the standard. How does all the other religions, how do they match up with how Christianity is set up? And that's kind of how they've done it. And it's an interesting way. I disagree that that's a good way to do it. I mean, Christianity is still the most prolific religion in the world. It's been everywhere across the whole world. It's there's very few countries that haven't had an influence from Christianity in it, especially over the last 2,000 years. The challenge, though, is there's lots of different kinds of religions and ideas of religion. So we probably need to update how we classify religion. That's one of the questions we have to answer. So I'm trying to answer that one myself for one of the essays we got to do. So it's just fun. Christianity is monotheism, and Judaism is monotheism. Islam is pretty much monotheism, but there's also polytheism, meaning many gods. Monotheism is one god. So polytheism is Hinduism, is polytheism. Confucianism is not necessarily a religion, as it is just a philosophy to follow, like Platonism, Stoicism, those kinds of things. But in some, if you loosely define religion, you could add all those in as religion. So it depends on how you define religion and what you think about it. So, if you have any thoughts or questions about what we've talked about this week, feel free to put them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. And then I'll be back next week and let you know a little bit more about some of the fun things that I've been learning this week as well. We'll see you then.